Right, so I'm going to make a start. So hello everybody, I'm committee member Harriet Cornwell from the Be Bold history team, and I am sat here with Luke Pepera, and we're going to be having a bit of an online discussion, a bit of online interview about your sort of field of history. So very welcome to have you to the talk, Luke. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's good to be
here. You have got an array of skills. So I was just reading that you are historian, archaeologist, anthropologist, broadcaster, and presenter. So on your screens, you can see that you have got some links with QR codes to Luke's blog, which is really good. I'm constantly on it when I get an email saying that there's been a new post added. There is also some really good videos with Dan Snow, with Africa written out of history, and also really interesting what if the RAF was defeated at the Battle of Britain, which I was having a sneaky watch before this talk started, so I hadn't seen that before, so that was really interesting. Okay then, so I'm just going to sort of unshare my screen so we can have a bit more of a discussion. So to start off with, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes. So I'm Luke. I'm originally from Ghana, and for the past, well, since graduating from university about maybe 5 years ago, I've been engaged in researching and also writing about, in an accessible way, writing about the histories and the cultures of Africa. And my main focus has kind of been to go beyond what the current narrative of African history is, which is heavily influenced by the last 400 years, and especially slavery and colonialism, because those are two aspects of our history that really inform, I guess, the treatment and attitudes towards Africans, and maybe some of the problems that Africans in Africa and in Europe have faced in more recent times. But I've been keen, since embarking on this journey of writing about African history, to go beyond those two subjects, and try and fill out the grander history of Africa, which is at least 10,000 years old. So that's what my focus has been, and I suppose more personally as well, I'm interested in music and in dancing, and a big fan of the Sherlock Holmes stories. So that's something that you won't see often on my blog, but hopefully tells you a little bit more about myself.
Oh, that's lovely, fantastic. So that sort of leads us into sort of our first question is, well, the sort of first thing that I'd like to mention to you is there's lots of history teachers at the moment really interested in the history of Africa. So it's being incorporated into quite a lot of curriculum. So I'm hoping that this talk in some way will sort of really help teachers perhaps inform their sort of subject knowledge, or perhaps take away ideas so that they can sort of implement into lessons. So can you sort of tell us where your passion for African history sort of emerged from? Because obviously there's been a lot of talk about the curriculum here in schools, and obviously there's been sort of more calls for diversity, or looking at sort of incorporating more sort of different cultures and different histories into the subjects. So I should imagine your diet was probably Tudors, I should imagine, something along those lines.
Yes, so we did Tudors and Russian Revolution, that kind of thing, which was fascinating with the curriculum. But for me, I would say my interest actually did begin just after, or maybe at the tail end of my school years, and it began somewhat, one might say arguably a bit selfishly, with wanting to just know a bit more about my family's past. So I was exploring a tiny bit more about exploring my Ghanaian heritage a bit more, because I'm someone who's always been, I've been lucky enough to be able to travel back and forth between the UK, where I went to school and university, and Ghana. But a lot of the elements of my Ghanaian heritage I'd kind of taken for granted. I'd not really had the opportunity to explore them in greater depth. So it began one summer in about 2012, and I was just looking into some of those aspects a bit more, and I met with lecturers at the University of Legon, which is Ghana's main university, or the University of Ghana in Legon, I should say. That's Ghana's main university, and I was speaking with them and I was learning about traditional kingship and some some medieval archaeology, or rather ancient archaeology. So, for example, in Ghana, there's a tradition of ironworking, which is quite ancient. And it's not something a lot of people, knew about. It's not something that's been widespread. Ghana's always been concerned with modernism, and the governments in particular have been concerned with pushing people forward and especially emulating Western cities. So it began then in that summer when I was just interested and getting to grips a bit more with my traditional heritage and my background.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm sort of a little bit aware of sort of the challenges in sort of researching medieval Africa. So obviously we're going to be talking about Mansa Musa. So before we sort of go into the challenges of researching about medieval Africa, so what do you think is the most sort of remarkable thing about him? So obviously there's quite a lot of lot of work that's recently been done on sort of Mansa Musa recently. So what do you think is sort of unique about him as a
Yes.
sort of historical character?
Yes, well, Mansa Musa, I mean, you have in most continents at one point in time or another of history, you have these figures who are kind of great innovators and people who really elevate the status of their kingdom, of their people, etc. And Mansa Musa essentially did that for Mali. Because you can have figures like, let's say, I don't know, someone like Henry V or Alexander the Great or someone like that who kind of elevates their civilization, their empire. And Mansa Musa was kind of like that. He wasn't actually very interested in conquest, but I would say one of the more remarkable things about him is that he changed and he really consolidated the power and prestige of Mali beyond its wealth. And he not only expanded the kingdom physically, one of his very exceptional generals was responsible for conquests of Gao and Timbuktu, which were taken from the Empire of Songhai. But beyond that, when he conquered those lands, he transformed, those cities, for example, into universities, and he made those centers of, learning and of scholarship, and places where people from all over the Islamic world wanted to come, and people were trading in books, and knowledge was highly sought after. And he was known as well, personally, Mansa Musa, for being a very virtuous character. He used to release a slave once a day, was one of the practices that he employed, and he was very tolerant as well. And I think perhaps more tolerant than a lot of the rulers worldwide, a lot of the contemporary rulers worldwide. So those who weren't in the capitals, people in the rural areas, wanted to practice their traditional religions a lot more, and he allowed that. And he even presided over witchcraft cases and took part in traditional ceremonies and that kind of thing, as long as laws were obeyed. And people, it was a very tolerant place. People could live largely in the ways that they wanted. So I think his benevolence, and I think his sense of duty to his people is something that is quite remarkable. He was very, despite actually his wealth, or maybe actually because of it, he was a very generous, not a very selfish, warmongering person. He just seemed to actually just be a very virtuous person, and the kind of ruler who, through ensuring peace and stability with his character, can really improve their own kingdom.
Fantastic. That's a really sort of a fantastic answer. So I really sort of reading sort of the historical sources, you do really sort of pick up on his piety and sort of putting sort of Mali on that very famous map.
Exactly.
So what could you say are the challenges of researching medieval Africa? So we talked a little bit about perhaps from a personal point of view, I quite like to use some of the alternative sources, sort of the storytelling and the oral histories, and trying to move students away from this perhaps massive assumption that it is just sort of academic sources. So when they see a source, normally when they come to GCSE, one of the sources they encounter is typically sort of written. So what would you say the challenges are in sort of researching sort of medieval Africa and using those alternative types of sources?
Yes, well, with all of Africa, and I think exactly like you pointed out, is that we don't really have a strong tradition of writing our history. We have a tradition of passing it along orally from generation to generation. In Mali in particular, and this is throughout most of Mali's, and it also happens, and it's also a feature of other African societies. But in Mali, obviously had a class of storytellers, the griots, who were charged with learning about and passing on the histories of the kingdom and of its kings and of its peoples. So, and exactly like you say, I think one of the issues, perhaps at least in in the UK and perhaps in the West more generally, is that our historiography, the way in which we maybe study and teach history, is slightly biased towards written sources, which is how someone like Hugh Trevor Roper, the author historian, can talk about how Africa, there is only the history of Europeans in Africa. And he's not saying that, he obviously doesn't think that Africa doesn't have a history, but he's saying when you're talking about history as a discipline, as a study of something, it is defined by researching and interpreting written sources. So I think one of the challenges actually, and this goes for African history everywhere, would be to kind of give equal credence to oral history and to material culture as well, to archaeology, which I think in some places is kind of taken for granted. Because when we study, I don't know, what the history of World War I, for example, if we're talking about the sense of loss which might have contributed to the Second World War, we would be talking about, graves, for example, grave sites and memorials and that kind of thing. So that's all material culture that technically falls in the realm of archaeology as well, not just anthropology. And, even the weapons people are using, you can get that from written sources, or you can actually get that from artifacts to tell you a bit more about people and what ordinary people were kind of doing. And I think also going back as well, obviously the literacy rates, and this is obviously across the world, is that literacy rates were slightly lower amongst members of the general population. So you tend to have a history which is written not only by winners, but by kings, by people who could read and write, so history can tend to be, in Africa as well, can tend to be skewed towards particular individuals and their narratives and their stories. But I think the main thing, one of the challenges is I think looking beyond, or recognizing that oral histories, all these other histories, are part of building up the story of the African past. I mean, Mali is a bit of an exception. It's quite good because we have the written sources, because it was tied into the Islamic Empire, as it were. We have written sources from other people, the travelers who came, even Batuta and these other people who traveled through the kingdom. But yes, considering these other sources and giving to them an equal weight that we do to written sources, because I think just because something is written doesn't mean, so people like to kind of denigrate oral history because they say it can continuously change and there are elements of mythology and fantasy and all these other things. But that's the same with written history. Just because someone writes that my king or my ruler had 50,000 soldiers doesn't mean that's necessarily true. But we tend to take written sources at face value a lot more than we do oral histories as well. So I would I would say is the biggest consideration to make, and the biggest.
It's also I think also adds to the discipline, but also gives sort of agency to sort of appreciating how histories are sort of, how as they're sort of followed through through stories and things in other cultures as well. So sort of highlighting that to students, I think, could be really powerful.
Yes, and I think it broadens perhaps students' minds if you tell them that actually there is not just one history and one singular narrative. There are histories, and depending, I mean, obviously in terms of curriculum, and obviously not wanting to confuse young people as well, I understand there's a tendency to obviously, to want to keep things a bit simple, but when you're exploring the history of other places, you have to look into the traditions of those places as well, because that informs not only what they record, but how they record as well. And just because someone records not using resources doesn't mean that history is any less relevant or any less true, because much of history isn't what we necessarily call factual, but it is true in the sense that the people were writing, this is how they saw the world. This is what they believed, and this is their perspectives. That is true. It doesn't mean it's necessarily facts, and I think that goes even more so for written histories, just because we're perhaps not as scrutinizing as we should be. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's some excellent points there. It was really interesting. Okay, then perhaps we should sort of move on to our sort of main event then, sort of to do with Mansa Musa. So
Yes, of course.
There's a question which has been asked by somebody that I work with. I think this is quite a good one. So did Mansa Musa, I haven't come across anything in my reading, did he have any rivals?
Yes, I found this question quite interesting as well. In terms of internal rivals, I don't think he had, mainly only because he was quite a popular king and he had quite a loyal, he had quite a loyal base of supporters as well. But he definitely had, and this was sort of empire-wide as it was in the empire, the Malian Empire had rivals before, during, and after Mansa Musa's reign. So one of the big rivals was the Songhai Empire, for example, whom Mansa Musa was fighting against, or at least one of his generals was fighting against whilst he was actually away on his pilgrimage. And it's from the Songhai that he took Timbuktu and Gao. And after Mansa Musa died, and the kingdom kind of entered a period of decline, it was the Songhai. Who previously, during Mansa Musa's reign, had to submit to him. And they had to pay taxes to Mali. It was the Songhai who, seeing an opportunity, actually conquered Mali. But this was sometime after Mansa Musa's death. But whilst he was on the throne, Mansa Musa himself, even on his way back from his pilgrimage from Mecca, he actually took two of the Songhai, the king of Songhai's sons. He took them hostage, and he treated them well and he educated them. But that sort of goes to show the extent of the the relationship between Mali and Songhai, even during Mansa Musa's reign, where Mali was kind of the preeminent power in the region, and Songhai was one of the more rebellious provinces which had been previously conquered by the first or one of the earlier kings of Mali. I think even the first one, Sundiata, but always posed a bit of a problem. And it was the descendant, I think, actually, of one of the sons that Mansa Musa captured, who went on to in turn conquer Mali when it was going through its period of decline. And then there were also the tribes as well of sort of the desert tribes who always acted as rebels and robbers, and sometimes disrupted trans-Saharan trade, which was obviously really important for Mali as well. So those, I would say, were the two main rivals. But within the kingdom, or at least external rivals within the kingdom, there doesn't seem to be a record of very many, which I'd expect because Mansa Musa was very popular. So It sort of makes sense.
That does really come through with the sort of the sources that you sort of come across from the sort of the written ones from the Islamic writers. Exactly. He's very popular. Okay then, so I know you've sort of touched on this briefly, but can you tell us a little bit more about the administration and the running of the government during Mansa Musa's realm?
Yes. I think the running of the administration and the running of the government during Mansa Musa's time was very similar to the running of government during some of the earlier kings' times. When the first emperor of Mali, Sundiata Keita, is the one who found Mali, as it were. So he defeats the king Sumanguru, who's the Soso king, the previous king of Ghana, or the king of Ghana, and he defeats him in battle in 1235. And then he sets up what's basically a constitution, which he calls the Kurukan Fuga. So it's an assembly, but in terms of the way the government actually worked, is that you had the supreme authority, which was the Mansa himself. So Mansa meaning emperor, and he acted as kind of the patriarch of all the people. He was sort of the king of kings, but you had the kingdom itself, or the empire itself, was essentially a loose confederation of different provinces, all of whom either through choice or through deliberate submission paid tribute to Mali. Because when Sundiata Keita went to battle against Sumanguru, there were chiefs of some provinces who automatically supported him, and there were those who weren't as keen. So there were some who became part of the king's inner circle, those who had supported him, and the descendants of those initial chiefs who had supporting him were those who remained very close to the Mansa, because they were those who were seen as being the most trustworthy. And then there were the chiefs of the other provinces as well, who ruled with a fair amount of independence, but who had to recognize the Mansa himself as being the supreme authority. And then you also had administrators from different levels, sort of the smaller the settlement. So you had a village master who administered sort of at the local level, and the county master, and then the province master, who would be one of these chiefs that I spoke of earlier, being overseen by the Mansa, by the emperor. So it was, and I think with the Kurukan Fuga as well, with this constitution, it was set up so that the provinces each had a fair amount of say, but there was a recognition of a supreme authority. So the Mansa had the final say, but actually it was a bit more republic-like. Actually, it wasn't like Europe, where you had a divine right of kings and an obvious hierarchy. It was kind of a collection of states, each with equal rulers, and then the Mansa kind of presides over them. So he's just above them, but he's not completely unchecked as well.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Right, so I was thinking next that we would sort of move on to perhaps the sort of standout event of Mansa Musa's reign, which is the pilgrimage.
Yes.
So every time I read about this, I'm still astonished about the whole process of actually of going on the pilgrimage, and
yes,
the story behind it as well. So could you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, well, I mean, legend has it, the story sort of goes that actually Mansa Musa is keen to make this pilgrimage to atone for the accidental death of his mother. So there's no way to kind of know exactly what happened with regards to his mother's death. But the story goes that he accidentally kills his mother, and essentially to atone for that sin, he asks one of his diviners, what do I do? Or one of his sort of teachers of religious knowledge, he says, what do I do? And they basically said that, make a pilgrimage in order to kind of, right the wrong of the sin that you've committed. So he organizes the entire kingdom basically to support this journey. And it's a huge undertaking, and it takes several months to prepare, for this, several 1,000-mile trip, and he organizes, obviously, as the narrative sort of goes, these 60,000, a retinue which is 60 to 70,000 strong, and camels laden with gold and with gold dust, and heralds carrying golden scepters and dressed in silk, and all the rest of it. I mean, a very, very, very grand affair. And as he's walking through as he's processing through the desert, it is every Friday, I think it is, he stops and he builds a mosque in the town in which he's staying. And there are some more people who join him on his retinue, and he's also trading in gold as he's going towards Mecca, and then obviously makes his famous stop in Cairo. But I think beyond the story of Mansa Musa also wanting to right this wrong, or to atone of the death of his mother, he was also keen to show off the prestige and power of Mali, which ends up succeeding, but he wants to demonstrate that actually there is a new power in West Africa, and in the Sudan, which is controlling, or is a big player in the trans-Saharan trade, and also has huge amounts of gold reserves with which it can trade, and to establish Mali as one of the great powers, I think, not only of the region, but of the world as well. So those are his main motivations for going on this grand pilgrimage.
Fantastic. So I think there's a source which I found sort of really interesting that was recorded by an Islamic scholar, which is the sort of story about Mansa Musa's sort of heritage, really, how he became emperor. The story of the Atlantic Sultan, which was mentioned. I know this has been interpreted in lots of different ways. So could you tell me what your sort of view on the on this is? Because I find it absolutely fascinating.
Yes. Well, I mean, it gives an indication that actually the Malians at this time were, you know, very familiar and perhaps actually very advanced at seafaring and navigating as well. So it's Mansa Musa's, I believe, great uncle, Abu Bakr II, who wants to make a trip. He doesn't exactly know what is west, but he wants to. He's rumored to be a bit of an explorer, and he wants to explore the waterways to the west of Mali, basically. So he actually makes one expedition, which he sends one expedition. That's when he doesn't go himself, which fails. So then he organizes an even larger one, a second one, and this one he goes himself. But what happens is that expedition basically disappears. It's unknown whether it reached its destination or whether it sunk, whether it failed as well. And there are some historians like Ivan van Sertima who make the case for it actually having reached the Americas, and so Africans having been some of the first people, one of the first people to reach the Americans, whatever it is, 300 years before, or maybe 200 years, 200 to 300 years before Columbus. But there's no strong evidence for that as of yet. But basically, when he goes, he leaves Mansa Musa as his regent, and because he doesn't return, Mansa Musa automatically becomes emperor. Which was maybe unfortunate for Abu Bakr, but very fortunate for Mali at least.
Yeah, definitely. Okay then, so if we can sort of look at the sort of quite famous sort of stop-off point at Cairo, because there's lots of sort of really interesting stories which happen here, including the sort of standoff between the Mamluk Sultan in Cairo.
Yes, the standoff between the Mamluk Sultan. But when Mansa Musa, so he basically stops for a rest, Mansa Musa. He stops for a rest outside Cairo, and the scale and the size of his pilgrimage creates a bit of a hubbub. So that's when the Egyptian, the Egyptian ruler, the Sultan, asks him we basically sends a scout to find out what's going on first of all, and then invites Mansa Musa inside. And Mansa Musa is grateful for being invited inside, but he's not keen, because part of the point of the expedition, like I mentioned earlier, is to demonstrate the prestige not only of Mali but of its ruler. He's not keen to have an audience with the Sultan, because he will have to bow before the Sultan and kiss his feet or kiss his ring or whatever it is, and he feels that might defeat the point and the objective, or at least one of them, of the pilgrimage. But he is eventually convinced, or the story goes that actually one of the Sultan's advisors whispers something in Mansa Musa's ear, and then suddenly he suddenly goes rushing forth. This is after making excuses. He says, I don't want to come in to meet the Sultan because I'm here for a pilgrimage. It's a holy march. So I'm not really here as a diplomatic. It's not really a diplomatic mission. But then, the advisor whispers something to Mansa Musa, and suddenly he goes rushing forth, and he kind of, kisses the Sultan's feet and is sort of full of praise for him. And my theory is that actually he heard because the Egyptian Sultan this time was known as well for being very, very pious, and also for being very, very, he's known, his name is Al-Nazir, and he's known for being a builder, and he's the kind of leader that Mansa Musa either is or wants to be. So I think he actually, when the advisor tells maybe Mansa Musa, I speculate that he told him some of Al-Nazir's achievements, and that made Mansa Musa instantly respect him. So then he goes to him and they talk for a long while. And then after he leaves, Al-Nazir gives him some gifts of armor and horses. And then whilst Mansa Musa is meeting with the Sultan, and also afterwards, his entourage are in town, and they're using some of the gold that Mansa Musa bought to buy the items in Cairo. But I think the inflation actually comes because the inflation really actually comes because the Cairo merchants are seeing the amount of gold basically hike up their prices. So they hike up their prices, but the Malians don't mind. They spend whatever whatever's asked of them, whatever the price is, they buy the items. But Mansa Musa's entourage actually spends so much gold there that he actually himself, Mansa Musa, goes into debt. But the economy is flooded with so much gold that there's huge amounts of inflation. So things that ordinarily would have cost, one gold coin cost 10 because there's just so much gold flowing around the economy now. And Mansa Musa himself is broke. So he says that when he gets back to Mali, basically, he borrows money basically for the remainder of the trip. And he says, when I go back to Mali, I will pay it off. So he borrows money, and then the Cairo merchants as well, they lend him money at very, very high interest rates. And then when Mansa Musa returns, he pays off all the debt in basically one huge payment, which again floods the economy with gold. And this on Mansa Musa's side is actually accidental, because he's not concerned necessarily with he's not concerned at that point necessarily with showing off. I mean, his piety is more important to him, but I think he's so rich anyway that kind of wealth is almost something that is not, as it were, a big deal to him. So he just wants to make good on that payment, but he does it in a way in which it also ruins the economy of ancient Egypt again. So he basically ruins it, restores it, then ruins it again, all in the space of, I don't know, a few years or whatever it is. Not a very long time frame at all. But yeah, so that's how that was, I think it was that visit in Cairo and that story which really put Mansa Musa on the map, because people just couldn't believe, I think, when they heard stories of it, that someone could have that amount of gold, especially in a kingdom that was at that time as prosperous as Egypt was.
Yeah.
So
fantastic. Yeah. Could you tell me a little bit about sort of Mansa Musa on his pilgrimage at Mecca and Medina, sort of just a quick description before we head back into Mali on our journey, on the return journey of the Hajj, if that makes sense?
Yes. Well, when Mansa Musa gets to Mecca, obviously he's doing what is required of him as a good Muslim, but he's also interested not only in, because he wants to also demonstrate, I think, for the sake of promoting Mali, but then also of securing the support of other Islamic rulers. So he wants to kind of tie himself into the importance of that, into the Islamic empire. So he's sort of building up these diplomatic ties as well with all the Islamic rulers, some of whom, or at least their representatives, are there in Mecca doing the duties that their faith says they should do. And he's concerned as well, whilst he's there, with who he's going to bring back to Mali as well, not only artisans and scholars and lawyers and that kind of thing, but also those people, people who are sort of high-ranking Muslims as well. Like he brings back some of the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. So whilst he's in Mecca, there is that aspect of doing the religious observance, but it's also a business and diplomatic mission as well, to an extent, sort of contrary to what he told the king of Cairo, but that was mainly because he didn't want to have to submit to him. But that's what he's doing a lot in Mecca when he actually gets there, is building up these ties and building up these relations.
Okay, fantastic. So I think there's lots of sort of archaeological evidence and architecture as well, which is sort of really fascinating about the sort of impact of the journey which Mansa Musa took. So could you tell us a little bit about the impact of the pilgrimage? Yes.
I would say the biggest impact of the pilgrimage is that the people who he brings back are some of whom allow him basically to really innovate and renovate Mali as well. I mean, he's quite lucky that when he comes back, his general has captured Timbuktu, and when on his way back, he actually stops off at Timbuktu after hearing news that it's been captured. And he has with him on his way back a retinue of poets and architects and mathematicians and philosophers, and then, like I mentioned, the Sharifs, the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. And he wants to build institutions that will connect him further to not only the Middle East, but also to Europe. So one of the scholars he brings back was an individual called Al-Sahili, who was a poet and also a drafter of legal documents. One of the things Mansa Musa wanted to do was to help institute Islamic law into Mali's, Mali's legal codes as well. And so he brings him back, but Al-Sahili is best known for the architectural innovations and the architectural projects which he carries out in Mali. So he oversaw not only the construction of the royal audience chamber at one of Mansa Musa's main palaces, but he also builds the Jengaberi Mosque in Timbuktu, which becomes one of the centers, I believe, of scholarship as well. And the building of the mosque and also the investment in the madrasas, because Mansa Musa in Timbuktu builds the madrasas, which are basically these the schools, the Islamic schools, the places of learning, and the investment in those are what make Mali an important center of scholarship and a more important center of trade and of connection with people from all over the Islamic world. Because at the universities themselves, not only are you people learning cutting edge information about different subjects, but there are also even exchange programs between this university, between Timbuktu and other universities in the Islamic world as well. So it's a real opportunity for him to tie Mali into the global, into the global network, and in particular into the Islamic network as well.
Fantastic. Can you tell us all about the libraries that are in Timbuktu?
Yes,
there's so many of them.
Yes, the libraries. I mean, unfortunately with Timbuktu, with that area, has been where Islamic terrorism, as of late, has unfortunately had a bit of an impact. But I mean, the books themselves had contained information on a whole array of subjects. I mean, there were books on astronomy and poetry and mathematics and things that, information in these books which only a few, sometimes decades or centuries later, were being explored in a similar kind of detail in sort of European scholarship, or in Central European, in European scholarship as well. And they were used also to help the students who came learn different languages, because you had to learn both Arabic and also West African languages as well. But yes, history, geography, physics, chemistry, astronomy, and some of the books today are have been kept in good condition. Some of them are in private collections as well. Others have been. There is a process, hopefully, of digitizing them, which I think would be great to be able to see the content in them. But there are just so many. I think even at the height, I mean, they're said to be, I think, close on to 2 million books or something like that. I mean, a huge amount. And this was at the height of at Timbuktu itself. But then traders would come, and just usually students, but anyone concerned with the university would be treating the traders or the strangers who came into the town really well, so that they could, in the hope that they had books which these students could either lend or, could either borrow or buy. And just the attitude, I think, towards learning even changed. I mean, one of the ways to become a prestigious member of Malian society at this time was to invest in scholarships or in the university. Similar actually to now, there would be donations and buildings would be named after people, and there'd be scholarships in people's names, that kind of thing. So which I believe it is arguably the world's first maybe modern university, because a lot of the features which we think about for our universities today were being practiced in Mali then, which is very interesting to think about all those years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to sort of wrap up the talk with a couple of other questions which I've got. So before we do that, could you tell us a little bit more about Ibn Battuta's perspective of the Mali Empire, and sort of his view on sort of what he saw when he visited?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. I mean, Ibn Batuta was concerned with, when he came, with really documenting, because he's known as a great traveler, and he's really concerned with documenting, as much as he can about Mali, meeting the important figures in the empire as well, and also getting to grips with some of the customs of the empire. So he's describing how people, he's describing the way the people are in terms of, are they a just people, etc. I believe he mentions actually the Malians being quite just and quite interested in justice, and therefore their towns actually being quite secure. But I think as quite a devout Muslim as well, he criticizes what he sees as a kind of liberalness, especially of the way in which the women dress and that kind of stuff. Which, because he said, I believe he talks about, them running around naked, which I think was a exaggeration. It's an exaggeration. I think he probably just felt they weren't as covered as they should have been, but I think that's an exaggeration on his part. But also the food and the customs and the way in which the rulers interact with the general population, and also the cleanliness of the town and the wealth of it, etc. Those are the kinds of things he's recording, and those are the kinds of things he's seeing. But he is full of praise for Mali, and for the way in which it's being run, even whilst he's traveling there as well.
Yeah. Okay, so our next question is about the position of women in the Empire of Mali. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, the position of women is something that's quite difficult to kind of pin down. I mean, as we know, even from from the story regarding Mansa Musa's own pilgrimage to Mecca, it was clear that actually the matriarch, the mother of the ruler, was seen as being an important figure in her own right as well. And even for Mansa Musa himself, I mean, there are stories, for example, involving his wives, because I think both African tradition and Muslim tradition as well would dictate that someone like Mansa Musa, a ruler, would have more than one wife. But actually, when he's in the desert on the way to Mali, not to Mali, to Cairo.
Mecca, yes.
Sorry?
Yes, to Mecca, sorry.
Yes, to Mecca, yes, to Mecca. Sorry, he's on the pilgrimage on the way to Mecca, but this is on the journey on the Cairo leg, as it were, and he travels with Inari Conte, which is I believe his main wife, as it were, and 500 servant women, and another was, and she mentions, or at least one of his wives mentions wanting how she misses swimming or bathing in the Niger. So he actually mentions this to one of his advisors, and that advisor basically has a bath built in the middle of the desert somehow, and irrigation channels in order to do this. So there is that kind of respect, I believe, for the royal women. But in terms of how normal women were treated, I mean, there is information to suggest that in terms of the slave class, those who were released once a day, the majority of them might have been women, but it's not something that is touched upon very much, not only in the Arabic records as well, but the material culture doesn't tell us very much about that, except for the fact that actually most of Malian society was quite just, and there were no obvious or unjust prejudices against women, which is probably an African influence, given the importance of women in African culture. And also, I think the fact that most of the Malian Empire, most of its citizens and its subjects were following traditional religion and traditional practices, as opposed to being influenced by Islam. The only ones who were really influenced by Islam were the elite. And Mansa Musa does make it the official religion of the empire. But it is mainly the elite who are actually practicing it, devoutly, devotedly.
Yeah. Okay then. So we've got two final questions for you. So this one I think is one which is quite important when we're trying to perhaps include sort of histories of Africa in sort of our curriculum. So some teachers perhaps don't have quite so much time to I don't know how to say this. It's just perhaps the whole thing around this is very sort of precarious. So perhaps some teachers don't have quite so much time to sort of teach like a whole unit of work on sort of Mansa Musa. So perhaps a way which you could potentially deliver it in your sort of classroom could be a sort of comparison to sort of contemporary rulers in Europe. So would you think that a scheme of work would potentially work like that?
I think the scheme work, I mean, in looking at it, I mean, at the time that Mansa Musa is alive and is operating and is going on the pilgrimage, etc., Europe is in a bit of a state of decline in terms of contemporary rulers. There are famines, and there's population decline, and there are also endemic wars. And then later on, this is slightly after Mansa Musa has passed away, or at least the major plague of the 14th century is after Mansa Musa has passed away in sort of the late 1340s. But in that early stages, whilst the Islamic kingdoms and whilst Mali in particular is flourishing, Europe is in slightly in a state of decline. It might be, it might be something where one can say, actually, whilst you're having these issues in, just in terms of focusing on kind of global history, that Europe is part of, obviously, of the global narrative, but actually whilst these things are happening, I mean, in Europe, and you have, this is slightly later on as well, just after Mansa Musa has died, but you have conflicts which are gearing up towards the 100 Years' War, and the destruction of the markets and of international centers of trade by I believe it's Philip the Fair, who's the French king at the time, who was destroying a lot of the international centers of trade, etc. And you have someone like Mansa Musa who's really gearing up into. Or another thing you could talk about would be, for example, how the pilgrimage puts Mansa Musa on the map, because I think it's very shortly. Well, it's slightly later on, but obviously you have Mansa Musa on the map as the stories are flowing into Europe of his pilgrimage are being recorded slightly later and also being sent into Europe. So Africa becomes, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Mansa Musa's rule is that actually it's probably Mansa Musa's fault is a bit harsh, because I think he was trying to do the right thing, but actually it's Mansa Musa who really makes Europe aware of Africa.
Yeah.
So very shortly after the publication of this map, of Abraham Crest's map, then you have the first expeditions, one of which fails. I believe it's in the 1380s, so it's literally like maybe 10 years after this map has been published. Then you have the first attempted expedition to Africa. And that doesn't go well. But it could be a case of comparing maybe some of the troubles that go on with some of the European kings versus the flourishing of Mansa Musa, just to give a bit of perspective that actually sometimes when other places, and this is the same with Africa with regards to other places or in other time periods, when one place in the world can be going through a decline, another is flourishing for other reasons, and that can be something to explore.
Yeah, I think that'd be a really nice comparison, isn't it? Looking at the flourishing sort of Empire Mali in comparison to what was happening in sort of that European context. I think that's a really good idea, actually. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay then. The last question comes from somebody else I work with.
That's fun.
Is it true that every crown in medieval Europe was made from gold from Mali?
Yes, this was an interesting. I don't know.
Specific question.
It's a very specific question. Someone trying to get their hands on the gold. I think.
Yeah.
I think it's difficult to say whether every crown was made. I mean, I would say that at this time, Mali is supplying at least 50% of the world's gold. So actually, a lot of the gold that's in the paintings and like medieval portraiture is coming from Mali. A lot of the gold that's in the jewels and in the the assemblages, like royal assemblages and royal jewels, is coming from Mali. But there are also gold sources, I believe, in Europe as well, like Hungary, I think, is also a minor source of gold as well. So it would depend how it would depend on how tied in Europe was, which it was, to be fair, was very, very tied into the trans-Saharan trade network. Wasn't just, I mean, the Mediterranean a lot more, but that was from the Mediterranean. Obviously, the Mediterranean getting their goods from North Africa, the North Africans getting their goods from the interior of Africa, the Mediterraneans who were sending that to Europe. So I perhaps wouldn't say every crown, but actually a fair majority of gold being, or the items in in Europe that are made of gold, Mali is the most likely source of them, because it is supplying 50% of the world's gold, up to 50% of the world's gold.
Wow. So these routes which you sort of see on the Silk Roads maps, they would have been mostly used to sort of transport the gold?
Yes, exactly. So you have, I mean, at this time we sort of think of globalization as being a modern thing, but actually trade is happening between Europe, Africa, and China, as early as the 14th century. I mean, at the very least, perhaps even earlier. And it is items being traded. So it's also what we call different trading nodes. So they're different locations across the entire world, and items are being traded locally, but they're flowing across these different nodes all the way from the Mediterranean to North Africa, to the interior of Africa, to India, to Egypt. So you can find porcelain, Chinese porcelain in Africa, and Indian carnelian in Africa as well, and then African gold in Europe. And so, I mean, it is a huge global trade network that's occurring, which all the most continents are. I mean, and this is the old world trade. I mean, that's part of the reason why the involvement of the New World, after Columbus's voyage to the New World there, that's why it changes so much the dynamic of the global world order, because it's suddenly the introduction of this new, things like these new crops and, cash crops, and there's a new way of going about trade and commerce, etc. But in the old world, these localities have been connected for centuries.
Fantastic. Well, those are all the questions that I have got for you from various people that I know and have worked with.
Okay.
So if there's anything else that you'd like to add sort of before I stop recording?
Yes, I mean, I would say that Mansa Musa is definitely a great one to start off with, but it's like I did with my historical palaces piece, sort of comparing Henry VIII with Alfonso. If you want to look for more kings and more rulers and more ways in which to teach different aspects of African history, those kinds of comparisons are also useful. I mean, Henry VIII and Alfonso are writing to the same Pope, wanting different things. So I think that is also a way of helping maybe students here in the UK specifically, who obviously should be learning about their own history, which is important. Reformation, Henry VIII is important because he changed the way in which he changed the religious and the moral fabric of England.
Of society.
The way around that. But if you just wanted to broaden that perspective a bit more, then looking at some of these slightly more obscure rulers, who I will hopefully be bringing more into light, would be an interesting way of getting people a bit clued into that history as well, and also trying to elevate the importance, or the way, or maybe change the way in which we look at things like oral histories. And I think that would maybe be the first step, is to teach in class. Actually, in history we've tended to focus on written sources, but actually oral material culture, these are also things which you can use to interpret history as well, and it's just as valid as written sources, either by contemporary historians or by modern historians. So I think that would probably be the big lesson, would be to argue for the validity of these other sources.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Luke. It's been an absolute pleasure to spend an evening talking about Mansa Musa. So thank you very much for meeting us, and hope to sort of be in collaboration with you again in the future.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Harriet. I enjoyed it. Thank you.